My name is Lorna Hastings. I'm 63 years old, and for 37 of them, I was the bookkeeper no one remembered at the company luncheon. But everyone sought out when the numbers stubbornly wouldn't close. I lived under the radar by choice and habit. A 2007 Corolla, a modest apartment overlooking a parking lot, and a desk that smelled of coffee and freshly printed paper. It was a Friday in May, late afternoon, when life decided to push me to center stage. I was retiring that night. Retirement they called it. And I was certain I would go unnoticed, as always. The navy blue dress I wore was the same one from my silver wedding anniversary that never arrived. And the necklace was made of glass beads I learned to mend myself. My life, at that stage, was spreadsheets, statements, and silence. I felt safe there, in the invisible. I spent the morning folding socks and checking, for the 1000th time, the brown folder where I kept everything that truly mattered. Contracts, receipts, transfer receipts, the promissory note signed by Margaret and Richard Wheeler, my daughter-in-law's parents. I placed small, colorful post-it notes on the flaps, like discreet flags of a country only I knew. At 2 in the afternoon, I tested the microphone in the reception room in my head, because public speaking has always made me sick to my stomach. At 3, I checked my lipstick in the elevator mirror, remembering my mother's advice. When your voice fails, let your eyes speak. At 4, I prayed in the parking lot, inside my car, counting the beads of my rosary in the grooves of the steering wheel. I wanted peace. I just didn't know I would find it amidst the noise. The club's lounge looked like a rented set. Starched white tablecloths, lily arrangements that smelled like a wealthy hospital, and a saxophone playlist that made every song sound the same. Old colleagues lined up like receipts, greeting me with phrases that seemed to have come straight from a template. You'll be missed. No, one reconciles like you. Going on a trip now, right? I responded with smiles that wore no teeth. At a table in the back, I saw my son, Damon, and his wife, Fallon. He adjusted his tie as if apologizing without opening his mouth. She wore a red dress that screamed, "Pictures first, facts later." The Wheelers, her parents, sat in the center of the room, aligned with the cake table as if the night were theirs. I grabbed a glass of water and hoped not to be called. The partner's speech began with, and I felt a sneeze of irony in the air. They showed a photo of me from 1991, with a computer that took up half the table, and someone laughed at my hairstyle. I laughed along, because I'm not one to argue over small things. As they clapped formally, I saw Fallon whisper in Damon's ear and point, undisguisedly, to the hem of my dress, where a thread stubbornly wanted to break free. It was the pointing of a sharp manicurist, not someone who wanted to help. I looked away to the cake, which bore my name in a cursive font I recognized from the labeling software. On the table, my brown folder looked like a fire extinguisher. I just didn't know that in a few minutes it would also become a beacon. My name was called into the microphone. The sound wire made that pock sound that always startles me, and I walked with a penny-counting gait. I intended to thank them, maybe make a joke about my 10 key and discreetly exit. But before I could speak, Fallon intercepted, grabbed the microphone like someone grabbing a glass in a toast, and said, with a textbook smile, that he hoped I'd enjoy retirement without bitterness. The room laughed politely. The second sentence came with a venom-laced scent. Because, let's face it, Lorna has always been tiny, cute, but useless. Damon didn't correct her. He just straightened his tie for the 3rd time. I felt the floor go silent. There was no blood, but there was a wound. Someone near the bar table muttered, "How unnecessary." And that gave me an invisible boost, like when we found 10 reas in a coat pocket. I asked for the microphone back with the calm accounting taught me, number by number, without skipping lines. "Fallon, I'm not tiny, just compact," I said, and there was nervous laughter. "But since we're mentioning usefulness, I'm grateful your parents found mine quite useful when I needed to transfer $2 million to them to save the company from a siege of creditors." I let the word millions land on the white tablecloth. The room turned to one ear. The lilies smelled stronger. 18 months ago, notarized signature, 6% annual interest with a guarantee on the lake house and the yacht, Margaret Ann, I continued, my fingers gliding over the brown folder as if reading Braille. "The Wheelers stopped payments 6 months ago. The messages are here. The trips to Aspen and St. Bart's, here, and the black card that pays off jewelry while ignoring interest, here," I spoke, and heard at the same time the dry sound of their house of cards hitting the table. Damon tried to whisper, "Mother," but the word was left without a surname. Fallon smiled toothlessly. Margaret pressed her glass as if to summon the waiter with it. Richard raised his hand to speak. A fiscal council habit, I suppose, but I was no longer on their org chart. "This isn't a courtroom," someone said. "Tonight's Lorna's night," someone else said. I picked up the microphone like someone picking up their house keys and finished. "The charge will be formalized on Monday. Until then, I ask for respect. Invisibility served me well, but it didn't protect me. Today, I'll adjust my focus." I handed back the microphone, drank my entire glass of water, and, for the first time in years, walked without shrugging. The room was divided between those looking at the file and those looking at the red dress. I left before the congratulations. In the parking lot, inside my Corolla, my hands trembled like thermal. Paper coming out of the machine. I called Patricia Morales, a lawyer I met at a community income tax clinic. She has a habit of tying her hair up with 2 clips that gleam in the cold office light like quotation marks. "Patricia, they're going to try the guardianship scam," I said, and just hearing myself say it gave me chills. "We'll go for it," she replied. We scheduled for 8 the next morning. Proactive neuropsychological report, extrajudicial notification, updated will, evidence preservation order, and a very strong cup of coffee, I added, trying to smile inside my voice. I spent the night setting up my little war room on the kitchen table. I opened color-numbered folders, blue for transfers, green for emails, yellow for statements, red for anything that flashed legal risk. I printed out the Wheelers' latest credit card statements, which I'd gotten through their carelessness when they'd asked me for help categorizing expenses. There was no more help. I stapled receipts, reviewed the loan agreement, attached screenshots of messages where Margaret called me darling, and, 2 lines later, requested a deferral due to a small unforeseen event. Small unforeseen events don't buy yachts. At 3:20, I stopped for tea and prayed again, this time without asking for anything, just to remember that I had the invisible one's back. At 8 o'clock sharp, I walked into Patricia's office and smelled the bittersweet scent of paper, ink, and strategy. She listened to me without interrupting, then spoke as if she'd already drawn the map before the trip. "Lorna, will anticipate their every move. Report now. Notification today. Request for document preservation from the club, the marina, and the jewelry store today. And if there's any question in court about your capacity, we'll react within hours, not days." I nodded and added an idea I'd gleaned from my practice. "I also want to organize the narrative in a timeline, with attachments and codes so any judge can easily understand." Patricia smiled. "You're the client every lawyer wants and the enemy no one wants." On the way back, I stopped at the bank to pick up an old power of attorney that kept Damon as my preferred contact in emergencies. Emergencies change clothes, preferences too. I sent him a dry, respectful message. Son, for now, we'll handle financial matters only by email. No intermediaries. Love you, Mom. And for the first time, I didn't wait for the green light. At home, I took a new notebook out of the closet and wrote on the first page, "Limits are the economics of affection." Next to it, I wrote down what would be my survival checklist: sleep, eat, breathe, document. I breathed, I ate an apple, I slept for 2 hours, and I woke up with the clear certainty of someone who has cleared a spreadsheet to start the correct version. The next morning, I woke with my body heavy, as if I'd undergone emotional surgery. I made stronger coffee than usual and watched the steam rise from the cup, remembering that even steam knows how to escape when it's suffocated. I opened the window and saw my neighbors leaving for work, each in their own invisible uniform. For years, mine had been discretion. But that day, I realized I could no longer hide behind the role of an accountant who only organizes other people's numbers. My own dignity was at risk, and I wasn't going to let the Bank of Life declare me morally bankrupt. Patricia called me early to confirm the ECE schedule. Neuropsychological exam at 10, notary's office at 2, meeting with Marcos, the financial advisor she trusted, at 4. I wrote everything down in my diary, as I did at the office, but for the first time, those tasks weren't work for others. They were about me, about my protection. It's funny how it takes us a lifetime to understand that we need to manage our own existence with the same discipline we manage spreadsheets. The exam was more intriguing than I'd imagined. The psychologist asked me to draw a clock, remember random words, and count backward from 100. I felt like I was undergoing some kind of secret life test, only this time I was the only one who knew its importance. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Miss Lorna, you have a sharp mind, if I may say so, sharper than many 30-year-olds. I left with a report that was more valuable than any jewel, proof that I wouldn't be silenced under the guise of incapacity. At the notary's office, I signed the updated will. My pen was steady, without a tremor. I made sure to state that my decisions would be respected during my lifetime, not just afterward. As I read the clauses, I thought of Damon. My son was still the boy who collected baseball cards and slept on the couch when he studied too hard. Only now, he was trapped in the Wheeler family theater, and I had to accept it. He might not see me again until the curtains fell. That afternoon, I met Marcus, a short man with thick glasses. He had a habit of scribbling arrows on any available paper. He calmly explained to me what I'd already suspected. The Wheelers were mired in debt far greater than the loan I owed. They kept the facade going by selling wind, Lorna, but wind doesn't pay for yacht fuel anymore. I laughed nervously, and he showed me spreadsheets tracking absurd expenses, chartered flights, vacation home renovations, jewelry purchases paid in installments on their corporate credit card. Their castle was crumbling. All that was missing was someone to pull the rug out from under them. I returned home with two opposing feelings, fear and power. The fear of facing not only my daughter-in-law's family, but also my own son, and the power of finally having evidence, documents, and competent people on my side. I ate a simple soup for dinner and sat on the sofa with the brown folder by my side, like a guard dog. As I scanned the papers, I thought about how ironic life is. I, who had always lived discreetly, held in my hands the weapon to unmask an entire family. The next day, the first retaliation came swiftly. Fallon appeared at the lobby of my building with expensive flowers and a practiced smile. I went downstairs because I don't like scandal, but she tried to start sweetly. "Lorna, you're tired, I know. Everyone is worried about your mental health. What you said at the club doesn't make sense. It was embarrassing for Damon. I took a deep breath and replied, Fallon, if your concern were genuine, you would have already paid what you owe. Bring a receipt, not flowers. I handed the bouquet back and went upstairs. The lobby fell silent. That night, Damon called me. His voice was divided between son and husband. Mom, you overreacted. People are saying you're unstable. Fallon was just trying to help. I swallowed hard but said firmly, Damon, I'm not unstable. I'm lucid, documented, and have lawyers. What's unstable is your trust in those who manipulate you, and I won't let them paint me as crazy just so you can avoid paying a debt. He was silent for a few seconds, then said, I don't know where you got this from, but I love you, Mom. The call ended cold. As I put away my phone, I thought about how many times in my life I'd softened my words to protect the comfort of others. How many times I'd swallowed a few frogs in silence just to keep the peace. Only now it wasn't about peace, it was about survival. If I backed down, I'd lose not only money, but also my voice. Knew that after a lifetime of invisibility, that was what they wanted most, for me to shut up. 2 days later, Patricia showed me the first signs of the Wheelers' counterattack. One of their lawyers had filed a preliminary inquiry with the court, questioning my ability to manage finances. It was the guardianship scam brewing. They're going to claim you're vulnerable, confused, and senile. They want to place you under guardianship to cancel the debt. I heard that and felt a chill run down my spine. But at the same time, something inside me flared. Then let them come. They don't know who they're dealing with. I spent the weekend preparing a dossier with Marcus. I wrote headings in blue pen, pasted receipts, separated invoices, and even stapled airline tickets to envelopes. It was almost like putting together a puzzle where each piece smelled like victory. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd always been good at organizing stories with numbers. And that's exactly what I did. I told the truth with paper. On Monday, Patricia filed the official notice, a 30-day deadline to pay the debt in full, under penalty of legal action and asset freezing. When we signed together, I felt as if I were signing not just a demand, but a declaration of existence. I, Lorna Hastings, would no longer be the discreet mother, the inconspicuous widow, the behind-the-scenes accountant. I was the protagonist of my own life, finally loud and clear. The Wheelers reacted as I expected, with arrogance. I received a written on gold letterhead, as if expensive ink bought credibility. The letter stated that I should reconsider my accusations, that any attempt to collect would be unfounded, and that if I persisted, the applicability of the injunction could be evaluated. I chuckled to myself when I read it because I was no longer the woman who shrugged in the face of intimidation. I stapled the letter to the file with the notation, threat, use to my advantage. That same day, Marcus called me, almost excited. Lorna, we've accessed bank reports that show serial transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, all in the name of shell companies linked to Richard Wheeler. This is explosive material. I sat on the couch, trying to process the gravity of it. Explosive is an understatement, Marcus. This is dynamite wrapped in gift paper. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about exposing a network of deception that propped up the Wheeler social castle. As I organized these new documents, I found myself remembering the first time I lent them money. Margaret had come to me with a string of faux pearls and a practiced smile, saying they just needed a cash flow bridge and that of course they'd pay it back with interest. She called me a silent angel. Funny. Deep down, I always knew angels don't pay for yachts. The difference is back then, I wanted to believe I was helping my son's family. Now, I only saw cynicism. On Tuesday, I met Damon for a quick coffee. He seemed smaller than I remembered, even wearing a suit that surely cost more than my car. "Mom, Fallon is devastated. You exposed our in-laws in public. This will destroy her family." I took a breath and replied, "Son, they destroyed themselves. I just turned off the stage lights." He lowered his eyes and stirred his cup without drinking. For the first time, I saw in him not just my boy, but a man lost between two versions of truth, theirs and mine. Late that afternoon, Patricia showed me a new piece on the board, recordings of conversations between Fallon and her mother, discussing how to get Lorna's brown paper and convince Damon to seek guardianship. I heard those voices and felt something between disgust and liberation. It was no longer paranoia. It was fact. I had proof that they were conspiring to erase me. Patricia put her hand on my shoulder and said, "This is worth more than any will. It's your voice against theirs, recorded." That night, as I lay in bed, my heart felt heavy, but not with fear, with sadness, because deep down I never wanted war. I just wanted respect, just for my dignity not to be used as a bargaining chip at family gatherings. But when they try to strip you of your very identity, you have no choice. I closed my eyes and promised myself, I will never shrink to fit at any table again. 2 days later, local newspapers began publishing rumors about the Wheelers. Nothing directly related to me yet, but there was already talk of a traditional family's financial crisis and unexpected debts. I saw the news on the bakery's TV and felt a strange pang of satisfaction. It was like watching a truth I'd always known finally surface, without me having to scream. The invisible woman was now behind the scenes of a public downfall. Marcus suggested I seize the momentum to reposition myself. "You have experience, Lorna. Build something new. Show that you're not just a victim, but also a strategist." First, I hesitated. Me starting over at 63? But that night, I scribbled the name Hastings Financial on a piece of paper. It gave me a chill. It was as if I'd just opened a door to the version of myself that had been bottled up for decades. I told Patricia about the idea and she smiled. "This isn't just a business, it's a message. You're no longer dependent on anyone. You're the boss of your own board." Her words echoed within me like a mantra. I spent the next few days exploring possibilities, calling former colleagues who trusted me, and gathering contact information from clients who knew how thorough I was. And little by little, I realized I didn't need to be invisible. I could be a role model. Meanwhile, the Wheelers were sinking. Margaret called 3 times, crying, saying I was killing the family. I recorded every call, word for word. Richard tried to intimidate me, talking about power relations. I recorded it. Fallon posted vague phrases about ingratitude on social media, but the comments accused her of arrogance. The mask was slipping, and I just watched, steadfast, without needing to shout. One Saturday, Damon showed up at my door unannounced. He looked tired, his face drained of color. "Mom, my company's credit has been frozen. My clients are disappearing. Did you know?" I took a deep breath and replied, "I knew because I was the silent guarantor of so many things, and I decided not to be anymore." He leaned against the wall as if he'd been hit by an invisible punch. I wanted to hug him, but I held back. Boundaries are also forms of love. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "They called me useless. Today, I hold them accountable." I slammed the pages shut and realized something had changed forever. I was no longer just a woman defending a debt. I was, finally, defending my entire life. The following week began like a whirlwind. Patricia called me for an emergency meeting. The Wheelers had officially requested order against me to open, seeing my name on a cold document, as if I were incapable of taking care of myself, was a punch in the gut. I held back the tears until I got home, but in the elevator, they fell like heavy coins. As I closed the door to my apartment, I vowed that I wouldn't let this define who I was. I had a clear mind, solid evidence, and loyal allies. The neuropsychological report we had already filed became my shield. The attending physician, Dr. Salazar, wrote a detailed report full of technical terms that, translated, essentially said, Lorna Hastings is more lucid than many executives I've examined. I read and reread that report like a love letter, because it gave me back something they'd tried to steal, my authority over myself. Meanwhile, Marcus brought up a strategic development. He had tracked a series of suspicious transfers linked to Damon. My heart sank. I wanted to believe my son was merely implicated, not complicit. But the numbers didn't lie. Some of the collateral he used at the company came indirectly from the Wheelers. He might not even know where the base comes from, Lorna, Marcus said cautiously. I clung to that hypothesis because the alternative would be too painful. At the preliminary hearing, I walked in with my head held high. Fallon was there, wearing a black dress that seemed chosen to suggest mourning, as if I had already died in life. Margaret, beside me, clutched handkerchiefs like an actress in an old soap opera. Richard constantly reviewing papers, trying to appear in control. And Damon couldn't look me in the eye. When the judge asked me to speak, I took a deep breath and said, "My name is Lorna Hastings. I've been an accountant for almost 4 decades. If I were still working, the court would pay me to detect fraud like the one I'm now trying to defend myself against. Here are my documents." And I placed the brown folder on the table. The impact was immediate. The judge looked at the report, then at me, and called for silence. Patricia presented the recordings of Fallon and Margaret talking about manipulating me. There was a buzz in the room. I watched Fallon's face drain of color, as if someone had turned off the light inside her. Damon lowered his head, and Richard tried to protest, but his voice sounded hollow. For the first time, I felt the narrative was no longer in their hands. As we left, Patricia hugged me. Today was just the beginning, but we've already overcome the most important. You showed yourself. I cried on her shoulder, not out of sadness, but out of relief. It was as if I'd been carrying a piano on my back for years and had finally put it down. There were still battles ahead, but I was no longer invisible. In the following days, my phone rang non-stop. Old clients called, saying they trusted me and wanted to join me on this new project. Hastings Financial began to take shape even before it had headquarters. I answered calls from my kitchen table with the smell of coffee and the sound of the wall clock ticking. Each signed contract was a building block in the construction of a stronger version of myself. Fallon, on the other hand, began to show cracks. He posted old photos with melancholic captions, as if he were the victim of a conspiracy. The comments were relentless. "You always disdained Lorna. Now deal with it." I wasn't celebrating this, but I wasn't saddened either. It was just the truth coming out, and the truth doesn't need makeup. One night, Damon texted me, "Mom, we need to talk. I'm starting to understand things I didn't see before." My heart raced. I wanted to hug him, but I also knew I couldn't let my guard down. I replied, "Talk, son, but know that I have clear boundaries now. Love is no excuse for abuse." He saw it and didn't respond right away, but deep down I knew the penny was starting to drop. While I was structuring Hastings Financial, I decided to rent a small office downtown. The space had tall windows and peeling walls, but to me, it was a palace. I set up a simple wooden table, hung old paintings, and wrote on the chalkboard, "Transparency is wealth." Every time I looked at that phrase, I felt like I was rebuilding not only my career, but also my identity. The Wheelers, meanwhile, were sinking at an accelerating pace. The yacht was put up for sale, the vacation home mortgaged, and gossip ran rampant in the social circles that once revered them. I watched from afar, without needing to intervene. It was the natural downfall of those who built their fortune on quicksand. And within me, a silent peace grew, the certainty that justice doesn't need revenge to be sweet. That month, I realized something transformative. I wasn't just fighting for money, nor just for my name. I was fighting to show the world and myself that aging doesn't mean being disposable. That a 63-year-old woman can be more strategic, more determined, and more powerful than all those who tried to silence her. It was the lesson life was forcing me to learn, and one that now I wanted to record. In the midst of this turmoil, I discovered that the Wheelers had accumulated over $400,000 in parallel debt spread across business credit cards and personal loans. Marcus showed me the list with the patience of a professor, pointing out line by line as if he were revealing a magic trick. They tried to hide it, Lorna, but it's impossible to mask so much expense for so long. I looked at the figures and felt a mixture of indignation and relief. They weren't untouchable, just polished frauds. The hardest part was dealing with Damon. My son still tried to justify it, saying it was all just misunderstandings, that Fallon's mother was emotional, and that Richard had a heart bigger than his head. I listened to him, but I knew those excuses wouldn't hold water. Damon, numbers don't lie. You can love your political family, but you can't change bank statements. He remained silent, and that silence hurt more than any accusation. It was the void between us that I didn't know if would ever be filled. Meanwhile, Hastings Financial was taking shape. I assembled my first team, 2 energetic young college graduates and a retired accountant who said he couldn't live without numbers. Our small office became a hive of ideas. I felt rejuvenated, as if I'd found a greater purpose. Each new contract was a personal victory, not just against the Wheelers, but against the old version of myself, which accepted being invisible. Then Patricia dropped another bombshell. They had filed a second lawsuit seeking to nullify the loan agreement on the grounds of defect of consent. In short, they said I had pressured the Wheelers at a moment of vulnerability. I almost laughed at that. They asked me for the money at a luxurious dinner table, Patricia. The bottles of wine were vulnerable, not them. Still, we knew it would be another legal battle. I spent nights reviewing documents, creating timelines, highlighting dates with colored markers. My apartment felt more like a bunker than a home. Sometimes I'd stop and look around, missing Harold, my husband. If he were alive, he might hug me and say, "You've always been stronger than you think." But at the same time, I realized that part of my strength came precisely from being alone. It was in absence that I found myself. One Sunday, I decided to take a walk in the park to breathe. The fresh air hit my face and I saw families laughing, children running, dogs pulling on leashes. I wondered if I would ever be able to take my granddaughter there. But at the same time, I set a clear limit within myself. There would only be room for reconciliation when there was respect. Without it, the blood bond didn't matter. This was my new yardstick of love. At the next hearing, Patricia presented a forensic report that dismantled the Wheelers' narrative. Every penny of the loan was tracked, from its transfer to its use on supplier debts. The judge looked at Richard and asked, "Do you confirm you used these funds?" He stammered. Margaret tried to intervene, but was restrained by the lawyer. I watched in silence, feeling as if years of oppression were being ripped away, piece by piece. As I left the room, Damon came after me. "Mom, you're going to destroy my family." I stopped, looked him in the eye and replied, "Damon, they're already destroyed. I'm just saving myself from the rubble." He wanted to say more, but swallowed his words. It was a hard but necessary moment. With every step, I realized that my freedom would come at a high price, even the distance from the ones I loved most. News reports intensified. Headlines spoke of financial fraud and collapse of millionaire's facade. I saw my name appear as the widow accountant who defied the Wheelers. It felt strange to become the subject of a public story. At the same time, there was a sense of justice in the air, as if, finally, the world saw who I was, not a shadow, but someone who dared to face giants. At Hastings Financial, a new client said something to me that I've never forgotten. "Ms. Lorna, I came because I need someone who isn't impressed by shiny coats. I want someone who understands the true value of money." That touched me deeply. I wasn't just collecting a debt. I was rebuilding trust, not only my own, but also that of others who had been fooled by appearances. Meanwhile, Fallon would try to reach out to me in messages, sometimes with forced humility, sometimes with venomous irony. I always responded with the same phrase, "See my lawyer." It was liberating to no longer fall into emotional traps. Each time I repeated this response, I felt as if I were building a protective wall around myself. And one silent night, writing in my notebook, I realized I no longer felt humiliated. On the contrary, I was standing tall. What began as defense had become reconstruction, and I knew there was still a long way to go, but I no longer feared the journey. For the first time in decades, I was directing my own narrative. The following days were a mix of exhaustion and triumph. I woke up early, responded to client emails, reviewed documents with Patricia, and still found the energy to visit the Hastings Financial office. The peeling walls no longer bothered me. On the contrary, they reminded me that solidity comes from what's built on the inside, not what's painted on the outside. With each contract I signed, I felt like I was signing away a piece of my freedom. It was during this period that I received an unexpected visit from Margaret. She showed up at my building wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk scarf around her neck, as if she were still on a social stage. She asked to go upstairs, but I met her at the lobby. "Lorna, we can resolve this between women, without court. You know Damon will suffer." I looked at her straight in the eye and replied, "Suffering isn't a bargaining chip, Margaret. What resolves this is payment." It was the first time I saw her gaze waver. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Masks fall faster when you look directly into someone's eyes." This phrase accompanied me in the following days, like a compass. I no longer feared confrontation. I knew that each attempt to intimidate me only reinforced the strength of my position. And deep down, there was a strange gratitude. Without the humiliation at the ball, I might still be cowering in the corner of the room. At the office, my young assistants amazed me every day. One of them, Julia, said, "You're a role model. You showed me it's never too late to start over." I smiled, moved. I, who had so often felt small, was now someone's inspiration. It was as if life had turned the tables, from invisible to role model. The Wheelers, on the other hand, were increasingly cornered. Jewelry stores no longer offered them credit. The social clubs suspended their membership due to non-payment, and old friends vanished like smoke. I watched from afar without needing to intervene. It was the natural effect of a life built on appearances, and I knew their downfall would be even greater once their debt to me was officially settled in court. One day, Patricia called me excitedly. "Lorna, we've obtained access to a complete report of their debts. They're technically insolvent. This means that if we persist, we'll have priority in freezing their assets." My heart pounded. Victory was closer. But along with the joy came a deep sadness. How could I explain to Damon that his in-laws' ruin was a direct consequence of their choices, not mine? In an attempt to talk, I invited my son over for dinner. I prepared roast chicken, the food he always loved as a child. But he arrived tense, almost without an appetite. "Mom, you're being cruel. They're desperate." I took a deep breath and replied, "Son, don't confuse justice with cruelty. I'm just demanding what's mine. And if they're desperate, it's because they chose to deceive." He didn't answer. He just stared at his plate as if trying to find a way back to the past in the seasoning. After he left, I cried quietly in the kitchen. Not because of his words, but because I realized our relationship would never be the same. Loving without boundaries is painful. It's like amputating a piece of yourself to save your whole body. And I needed to accept that my motherhood was no longer about holding someone's lap, but about boundaries. The following week, the court ordered a partial freeze on the Wheeler family's assets. The yacht was officially seized, and the lake house was added to the list of seizable assets. Newspaper headlines proclaimed the downfall of the model family. I read the news and felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It was confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that everything I'd carried alone was now public knowledge. Fallon tried to approach me again, this time with real tears. She said she was pregnant and that Damon was in pieces. My heart stopped for a moment. Grandchildren had always been a distant dream, and now the real possibility was before me. But I took a deep breath and replied, "Whether it's for the child you're carrying or for my son, I won't close the doors. But know that broken trust can only be rebuilt with real bricks." She cried more, but I held firm. I wrote in my notebook that night, "Life gave me the chance to be a grandmother, but it also gave me the chance to be whole. May I be able to be both without letting one destroy the other." I closed the notebook carefully, like someone keeping a prayer. I knew the next few months would be decisive, not only in justice, but also in my heart. The following days were marked by a strange contradiction. While justice was progressing in my favor, my heart was racing with the news of Fallon's pregnancy. I walked around the apartment as if carrying two heavy suitcases, one full of legal victories, the other of emotional doubts. Was it possible to reconcile the necessary firmness with the tenderness that arose with the idea of a granddaughter? I didn't know, but I promised myself not to repeat the mistakes of keeping quiet to fit in with others. Patricia was blunt. "Lorna, now is not the time to slack off." Her pregnancy could become a tool for manipulation. Stay focused, debt paid off, and boundaries clear. I nodded, even though my heart was breaking. The lawyer's clarity served as an anchor, because with every sweet text from Fallon or hesitant call from Damon, I felt a part of me wanting to return to my old role as the conciliatory mother. But I knew that role no longer served me. At the office, things were thriving. Hastings Financial was starting to gain market recognition. I received invitations to speak on financial planning in adulthood, and I accepted one. Nervous as a teenager at her first job, I took the stage in a simple but packed auditorium and told my story without embellishment. At the end, a woman in the audience hugged said, me. "You gave me the courage to face my family. Thank you." I returned home with tears in my eyes and the certainty that my story was no longer just mine. Meanwhile, Damon seemed torn. Sometimes he'd call me asking for understanding for Fallon. Sometimes he'd disappear for days as if caught between two worlds. I listened patiently, but kept repeating the same phrase. "Son, my love for you doesn't change, but neither do my limits." He grumbled, saying I was too harsh, but deep down, sensed the wheels of truth were turning. And perhaps for the first time, he'd have to face life without invisible crutches. One rainy afternoon, I received the official news. The Wheelers were in the process of liquidating their estate, jewelry auctioned off, cars returned, the lake house about to be repossessed. I read the report and felt a wave of justice course through me. It wasn't revenge, it was balance being restored. As an accountant, I'd always believed that everything had to add up in the end. And there, after so long, the books finally closed. But their downfall didn't erase the void between me and my son. One night, I wrote in my notebook, "Winning in court isn't winning in family." And I cried alone, remembering the times when Damon would bring me colored drawings from school and tell me I was his hero. Now, I was the same woman, but I had to accept that heroes also set boundaries. Little by little, news of my determination began to spread among neighbors, friends, even former colleagues. Some stopped me on the street to say, "You represent us." Others commented on social media. It's inspiring to see an elderly woman standing up to the powerful. I smiled humbly, but inside I felt something I'd never experienced before: pride in myself. It wasn't vanity, it was overdue recognition. Fallon, in turn, tried to get closer. She sent ultrasound photos, messages filled with emotion, as if to pull me back into the circle of trust. I looked at those images and heart softened, but my reason remained firm. I replied to one of them, "I wish you and the baby health, but respect is a prerequisite for any rapprochement." She didn't respond right away, and I knew my words were harsh, but they were true. At Hastings Financial, Marcos surprised me with a gift, a simple plaque that read, "Invisible no more." When I saw it, my eyes filled with tears. He smiled and said, "That's what you needed to hear, Lorna, and that's what the world needed to see." I put the plaque on the living room wall, and every time I walk into the office, I read it like a psalm. One Saturday, I went to the market and noticed that people looked at me differently, not with pity, but with respect. It was as if the community had understood that this gray-haired lady driving an old Corolla was also a woman capable of toppling an empire of appearances. This silent recognition was, perhaps, one of the greatest rewards of my journey. Still, the emptiness of wounded motherhood stayed with me. I wanted to be able to embrace Damon without reservations. I wanted to be able to dream of my granddaughter without fear of being used as a bargaining chip. I wrote in my notebook, "Loving is easy. Loving with limits is art." And I decided that my life from then on would be this constant exercise, balancing firmness and tenderness without ever fading away. One clear autumn morning, I received an envelope at my office. It was a letter from Damon. He said he was beginning to see the truth, that he realized how he'd allowed himself to be manipulated, and that he didn't want to lose his mother in the process. I read and reread every word, crying softly. Perhaps there lay the first brick in a new bridge between us, a bridge I would only cross if it was built on transparency and respect. Damon's letter affected me more than I'd like to admit. I folded the paper carefully like a reliquary and tucked it into the brown folder, not because it was proof, but because it was a symbol that my son still existed beyond the Wheeler family's shadows. I spent the night awake, remembering the times he, as a boy, would lie on the couch with his head in my lap, begging me to review his math problems. A mother's love never fades, it only learns to protect itself. The following week, Patricia informed me that the final hearing was scheduled. It would be the end of the case. Either they would pay off the debt under penalty of full execution, or the judge would order forced liquidation. It was the culmination of a saga that began with a public humiliation and now ended in court. I donned my best gray suit, not to impress, but to remind myself that dignity is also expressed in posture. The courtroom was full. The Wheelers entered tensely, their usual glow gone. Fallon held her already visible belly, as if the baby were a shield. Damon, beside her, looked exhausted. Patricia firmly opened our defense. She showed the statements, the reports, the recording. The document was a brick that solidified my version. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I stood and said, "I've spent my life settling other people's accounts. Today I'm here to settle my own. I don't ask for favors, only justice." There was silence in the room. Richard tried to argue, but his own lawyer interrupted him, aware of the fragility of the case. Margaret was crying, not from remorse, but from loss. Fallon lowered his eyes, and Damon finally looked at me. His gaze held an apology. Couldn't be put into words. I took a deep breath, feeling that this moment was not only a legal victory, but also an emotional watershed. When the ruling came down, it was clear. The debt was to be paid off within 60 days, with interest and correction. In case of non-compliance, the already seized assets would be liquidated. I closed my eyes and felt a wave of relief wash over me. It wasn't just about money, it was about validation. It was the world telling me I wasn't the crazy one, but the victim who stood up. Outside the courthouse, journalists gathered. Someone asked, "Mrs. Lorna, how does it feel to defeat one of the most influential families in the city?" I calmly replied, "I didn't defeat anyone. I simply defended myself. The greatest victory isn't against them, it's in favor of my dignity." The sentence came out more beautifully than I'd imagined, and I saw pens rushing to write it down. For the first time, my voice resonated with the public. Back at the office, my assistants greeted me with hugs and flowers. Julia said, "Today, you showed that age doesn't limit courage." I smiled, moved. Marcus brought a bottle of cheap wine, and we toasted right there in plastic cups. It was a simple celebration, but charged with meaning. I didn't need luxurious halls to feel victory. The feeling that I was finally whole was enough. In the days that followed, I began to dream of my granddaughter. I imagined a bright-eyed baby laughing in my arms. But along with this dream came the reminder of the condition I had set, non-negotiable respect. I would not allow myself to be used as a babysitter or a reconciliation tool. If Emma, a name Damon had already mentioned, came to me, it would be within clear boundaries. Love without fading. That was my new rule. Fallon, perhaps sensing her inevitable downfall, wrote me a long message. For the first time, there was no irony or manipulation. She said she regretted it, that she was learning to see beyond her pride, and that she truly wanted a chance to rebuild. I reread the text several times, suspicious, but something in the simplicity of the words seemed sincere. I simply replied, "Time will tell. Prove it with actions." At Hastings Financial, I began receiving invitations from even larger clients. People who, years ago, would never have noticed me, now sought my services because they saw in me solidity and courage. I accepted some, declined others, always focused on not repeating the Wheelers' mistakes. The firm grew, but I didn't want to become a spectacle. I wanted to remain a beacon for those who truly needed transparency. One afternoon, Damon came to me. He was thinner, with dark circles under his eyes. "Mom, I don't know if I still deserve your affection, but I have to tell you, Fallon has changed, and so have I. I want Emma to know the grandmother I almost lost." I looked at him and felt my heart tremble. I didn't answer right away. I just held his hand like I used to when I was a child and let silence be our first bridge back. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Love can be hurt, but it doesn't die. Respect can be broken, but it can be rebuilt. I'm no longer invisible, and I won't let anyone erase me again." I closed the notebook with tears in my eyes, knowing the journey wasn't over yet, but that, for the first time, I was walking without fear. Emma's birth happened on a cold winter morning. Damon called me from the hospital, his voice cracking. "Mom, she's here. She's perfect." My heart raced. I wanted to run over, but I also knew I couldn't forget the boundaries I'd set. I replied, "I'm happy for you. Let me know when the time is right for you to meet me as a grandmother." It was a mix of joy and restraint, like drinking sweet water from a glass rimmed with salt. 2 days later, Fallon sent me a photo. Emma, wrapped in a white blanket, had her tiny hands clenched into fists. There was no elaborate caption, just, "She deserves you in her life," disarmed me. I spent long minutes staring at the image, remembering how I held newborn Damon with the same trembling hands I do now. I understood in that moment that life offered me a fresh start, but only if I had the courage to accept it without giving up on myself. The first time I saw Emma in person was emotional. Fallon was serious, makeup free, visibly tired. Damon looked anxious but happy. They placed the baby in my arms and I felt a warmth run through my entire body. Emma opened her eyes for a few seconds, and in those small gazes, an entire universe could fit. I kissed her forehead and whispered, "You'll never see me, invisible little one." It was the most sincere promise of my life. Still, I maintained the conditions I'd established. Discussions about visits were made clearly. I requested they always take place at my home or in neutral locations without emotional manipulation. Surprisingly, Fallon agreed. Perhaps motherhood had softened her edges, or perhaps it was the financial downturn that forced her to rethink her roles. Either way, it was a new dynamic, and I wouldn't let her slip into old patterns. At Hastings Financial, the routine was intense. Clients were growing, contracts were multiplying, and I was starting to be invited to give interviews about financial resilience in maturity. Seeing myself on TV, talking about transparency and boundaries, I realized my life had come full circle, from an invisible accountant to a respected voice. Each humiliation had become a stepping stone. Damon began visiting more often, almost always bringing Emma. The visits were silent but charged with meaning. He helped make coffee, put the baby in the stroller, and sometimes looked at me as if he wanted to apologize again. I didn't demand words. Time had already shown that our bond could be forged, as long as there was no longer any invisibility between us. Fallon, for his part, demonstrated subtle changes. He no longer spoke arrogantly or used poisonous phrases. On some visits, he even asked me for advice on basic finances, admitting that he had never understood numbers. I responded calmly, without irony. Perhaps that was the greatest revenge, not to destroy, but to teach, to show that knowledge is power, and that power, when used ethically, heals wounds. One night, I received an unexpected message from Margaret, a short text. "I know I was wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted to acknowledge it." I read it over and over. Unsure of what to feel, I didn't respond. I understood that some doors need to remain closed, not out of resentment, but for health. I had already regained my dignity. I didn't need to open up loopholes that would put me at risk again. I wrote in my notebook, "Forgiveness is a choice, not an obligation. And sometimes the wisest choice is not to go back." This phrase gave me a serene peace. It wasn't bitterness, it was awareness. I could walk lightly, knowing I had done what I could without sacrificing myself again. Emma was growing up fast. Her first laughs filled my house with a music I'd forgotten what it sounded like. In her eyes, I found a new reason to stay strong. I didn't want her to inherit a grandmother who shrank to fit in. I wanted her to know from an early age that true love has limits. On Hastings Financial's 1-year anniversary, I organized a small celebration at the office. My employees and some loyal clients were present, and to my surprise, Damon showed up with Fallon and Emma. They brought a simple cake, but the gesture spoke volumes. We sang happy birthday, toasted with juice and cheap wine, and in that moment, I realized that life, with all its cracks, could still be beautiful. As I closed the office door that night, alone, I looked at the sign hanging on the wall, "Invisible no more," and smiled. It was true. I had gone through the hell of humiliation, manipulation, and pain, but I came out the other side whole, strong, and standing tall. And now I had not only justice, but also the chance to write a new chapter with my family under conditions that respected who I am. At the end of that year, I received official confirmation that the entire debt had been paid off. The liquidation of the Wheeler estate fully covered what they owed me, plus interest and adjustments. When I saw the amount deposited in the account, I didn't feel euphoria, but a profound silence. It was as if, finally, the weight I'd carried for so many years had been lifted. The money was important, of course, but more important was what it represented, the recognition that I'd been right all along. I saved part of the money to invest in Hastings Financial and part to ensure a peaceful old age. But the biggest investment I made was in myself. I started taking painting classes, bought books I'd always wanted to read, and traveled alone to a small town in the countryside. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself the right to spend time and money on myself, not just on others. It was liberating. Damon continued to get closer, little by little. He never made a formal apology, but every gesture he made toward Emma was a silent form of redemption. When I saw him teaching his daughter to crawl on my living room rug, I understood that perhaps this was his way of saying, "I've learned," and I accepted, because sometimes the most sincere apologies come not in words, but in actions. Fallon also changed. Her arrogance gave way to a simpler, more jaded, but real woman. She started working part-time at a small shop and, little by little, stopped pretending to a grandeur that never existed. I didn't become her friend, but we began to live together with mutual respect, and that, for me, was already a huge victory. Emma became the light of my days. Her every smile was a reminder that life owed me not only scars, but also gifts. I held her in my arms and thought, "You'll never grow up thinking your grandmother erased herself to fit in." This was my most precious legacy, her example. Money could be lost, but the dignity I had gained, no one could take away from me. One afternoon, Patricia invited me to give a lecture at the university. I spoke to young law students about how easy it is to manipulate narratives when the target is an older woman, and how crucial it is for them to learn to defend themselves. At the end, I received a standing ovation. It was a symbolic moment. I, who had once been invisible, was now a voice for so many others. In my notebook, I wrote, "I will never again accept the role of an extra. I am the main character in my own story." Reading that sentence aloud, I realized how my life had changed, from a humiliated woman at a retirement ball to an elderly woman who runs her own company and sets her own limits. The journey had been tough, but profoundly transformative. That Christmas, we gathered the family at my house. No lavish parties, just a simple meal with dishes prepared by everyone. Damon held Emma in his arms, Fallon helped set the table, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace in the room. It wasn't the peace of forced silence, but the peace of a new agreement, respect above all else. As I watched Emma play with the tree ornaments, I understood that my story didn't end there. It simply continued into another generation, with the hope that the lessons learned wouldn't be lost. I had chosen to break the cycle of submission and manipulation. My granddaughter, would inherit a different example, that of a grandmother who refused to let herself be erased. On New Year's Eve, I sat alone on my apartment balcony and watched the fireworks light up the sky. I remembered the retirement ball, the humiliation, the brown paperwork, the tears, the courts. It all seemed distant, as if it had happened to someone else. I smiled as I realized that pain was the starting point for the most authentic life I've ever lived. The next morning, I wrote my final entry in my notebook. Respect is not a luxury, it's a necessity. And love without respect isn't love, it's a prison. I closed the pages and felt a peace I'd never experienced before. Not because life had become perfect, but because I had become whole. And so, at 64, I finally found the freedom I'd silently sought for decades. I didn't need a stage nor applause, just the courage to stand up when they tried to erase me. Today, I look back without fear and forward with hope. Because I know I'm no longer, I am Lorna Hastings, and this is my story of overcoming.